What the heck is a brand?
Yeah, great question. And it's an important question because brand, the reason why they select you, it's the reason they go to you versus go to Amazon.com or Walmart to buy the cheapest version of that thing.
What you're about to hear is my conversation with Preston Rutherford, the amazing marketing mind behind Chubbies that got a 9-figure IPO, and he's also one of the co-founders of Loop Return, which is one of the most exciting platforms for Shopify returns on the planet today.
But one of the decisions you have to make is, are you a family or are you a team? So family makes very different decisions on how to discipline, who's in or out, right? Very different from a team. It's a real decision. The revenue you have when you turn everything else off. What do you have when you turn off your ads? What do you have when you stop new product launches? What revenue would you have if you turned off all of your promotions and discounts? What then do you have? The only way to get to the most profitable form of new customer acquisition and retention, where it's when people come to you without being prompted by any kind of direct response. That takes changing mind.
Yeah. And we've seen, Nike did this thing, like amazing commercial. Never mention a day that, buy our shoes, buy the cleats, never mention buy the jerseys or anything like that. Ads like these, the one that tells the story, they never tell to sell you anything. How do you measure, ROAS on that, ROI on that?
That's the billion-dollar question, right?
Hey, Preston, welcome to the show, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing today? Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. We're fantastic, We're listening to a lot of the podcast, the HustleCon thing that you guys did, and all the amazing things that you're sharing on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and, other podcasts that you've been on. Fun getting to know you, getting to know the identity behind the brand and stuff like that. I hope it's going to be a fun conversation.
I'm sure it will be. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for checking some of that stuff out. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Every single time I host anybody on the podcast, one of the things that I have learned, which I ask almost everybody, is what's the earliest context you have of your life? Like behind all the success, because you're now associated with Chubbies, you're associated with Loop Returns. Behind all of these successes, who is Preston? What's the earliest context you have of your life that you can give us?
Wow. That's a great question. So, born in Tucson, Arizona, and actually Spanish was my first language. So I think that's one of the first memories that I have is just learning Spanish and just being a little guy. I guess I don't remember back to when I was crawling, but just living in Tucson. I'm an only child, and just playing around with my parents, I think, is just one of my earliest memories. And I felt so fortunate. My parents were just very loving, very involved and invested in allowing me, even though it didn't really come from means or money or anything like that, but just giving me an opportunity to get exposed to things, play sports, learn about the arts, all of those sorts of things, go to good schools. So I feel very fortunate and was always surrounded by I think love and positivity and support. So I think those are some of the first early memories that I can think of.
Awesome. What a cool memory to have. Do you think, those early memories and your brought up has made you a better entrepreneur today?
Yeah. And it's hard to tease those things apart, but one of the most productive or constructive views I believe an entrepreneur can have is whatever their background, use it as something that will help you, something that will fuel you, something that adds to your story rather than an excuse why you cannot do something. I was very fortunate to have the upbringing that I have, but to the extent possible, I tried to use every bit of it as what makes me who I am. And many of the great founder stories that I read about, they did the same thing. None of them used it as an excuse for why they couldn't do something. So I think that's one of the key takeaways that, because I'm obsessed with learning from other founders, Charlie Munger calls them the becoming friends with the eminent dead. And whether or not they're dead or alive, it's one of my absolute favorite ways to spend time when I'm not working.
What have you learned recently?
What have I learned recently?
Yep.
Oh, great question. What have I learned recently? Well, been listening to the Founders Podcast, which is great. And one of the most recent ones was about Les Schwab, who Charlie Munger said was one of his favorite entrepreneurs. And one of the takeaways from Les is incentives and the importance of incentives as you think about building an organization, building a team, growing something. Now, that's not necessarily going from 0 to 1, but maybe 1 to 100. But I thought that was a very interesting component. The second, I think, is also comes from Les, is simply doing something the way you think it should be done, ignoring commonly held wisdom. I think that's one of the things that I've always tried to do, is just look at everything from a blank slate perspective, kind of like completely ignoring what had been done in the past, because what had been done in the past is what got us to where we are today. And if you have a better vision for the world, it's going to take something else. And all of those rules are, in theory, meant to be broken. So I think those are the two things from a recent podcast that I totally learned. And it also harkens back to Steve Jobs being one of my favorite entrepreneurs, and one of his videos that hasn't gotten a lot of notoriety is the one. It's an older one. I think it's you can find it, I think, at like the Computer Museum or the Silicon Valley Computer Museum, where he fundamentally talks about the fact that this world, everything in this world was made by humans no smarter than you or me, and that we as individuals, there's no reason why we don't have the same ability as anyone else to completely mold this world in which we live, everything about this world in which we live. We don't necessarily have to view this world as fixed or immutable. We as individuals, exactly who we are, have just as much of a possibility of changing the world, molding the world, as any other human on this earth. And so those are some ties that I made that help me just every day understand that it's possible. There's no reason why I or any of the listeners of this podcast can't do the thing that they want to do.
That's powerful. Okay. I know it's going to be like a deep conversation, but I did not expect like us to get so deep like this early on. Okay. So, we have spent quite a bit of time researching you, researching the brand, researching companies that you build, companies you invested, the newsletter, the things that you talk about. We've been through almost all kinds of content that you're producing. And one of the things that, I've seen multiple times people have asked you is, how do you build, Chubbies? Because people have associated your identity to that brand, rightfully so as well. I want to ask you why you build Chubbies, like why exactly, and then why build Loop Returns? Because I've used both of them. So I just want to know from personal perspective why both of them exist and why you build those.
Sure. Great question. Why on Chubbies? Honestly, it was, I'd say, both offensive and defensive. So on the offensive side, well, let's start with the defensive side. I was not that good at working for other people. And it did not feel like the place where I was most fully alive. And I think the three other Chubbies co-founders felt somewhat similarly, and that there was a feeling in our bellies or in our guts that there was something else that life held for us. So I think that was the defensive piece. The offensive piece was we were in a place where we were out of college, had worked for 4 or 5 years, felt like we had learned some things, felt like we could do it now that we had been in the quote unquote working world, working for other people for some time. I think we felt naively or not, that we could do something, that we could build something, and that we wanted to. And this was before we were married, we had children, before we had mortgages. We were just paying rent in San Francisco. Our P&L was very simple. And not that that's a reason why not to start, but at the time it allowed us to, I think it was a point that gave us all reason to start. And it just seemed fun to get to work with 3 of my best friends and to start something that seemed like it would positively impact the world. Now, we honestly didn't even know what we would start. So the way I like to frame it is we were entrepreneurs in search of a company, or entrepreneurs in search of a problem to solve. That's how it started. But we got to a place where we sort of realized, okay, what is our circle of competence? And it wasn't going to be building the next social media app, which some of our friends did actually build from Stanford. So that was legitimately something that people did. And again, harkening back to the Steve Jobs quote, it's just amazing. But we felt that there was a consumer product that, for a variety of reasons in our backgrounds, each of our individual backgrounds, I think we felt pulled to a physical product that we could sell to consumers for whatever reason. My reason was my previous experience was very much in consumer internet software, selling advertising space in a digital product. So it felt very, not, again, of course, not that there's anything wrong with that, but the lack of something tangible where I could sell you something, you pay me money at the time of the transaction, and then I deliver you a product that you can touch and feel and that I can see you smile when you receive it. That was something I craved. And I think, again, we all had our reasons why we were pulled to making a consumer product. So I think the why was very much, gosh, this would be so fun. What a blessing to be able to work with our best friends and just go for something, go all in on something to create something. And then number two, I was really tied to creating a consumer physical product. And then I think number three, we felt that there was a product gap and a brand, although we weren't very articulate on what brand meant, but an ethos or an identity or even a vibe gap in the market. I mean, I think at the time, shorts were very long, heavily pocketed. So it did sort of feel like there was a little bit of a, hey, I feel like there is a product differentiation to be had here. But then maybe equally important or more important, we just felt like men's fashion at the time, men's apparel at the time was an extremely exclusive, you're not cool enough for us vibe, unfriendly, unwelcoming, not fun. And so from that perspective, we felt like, oh my gosh, this just needs to exist. It doesn't exist. The way that these other apparel companies, clothing companies are talking to us, just, I don't want to hear it. I don't like it. And it's not the way I would do it. So there was also a bit of, gosh, there are some broken things to fix. So that's a little bit of the why on Chubbies. On the why on Loop, I mean, we were in Chubbies and we felt pain. We felt pain firsthand with how rough returns and exchanges were for, most importantly, for our customer, but also for our team and for our P&L statement. So for the customer, it was very slow, many, many emails, having to photograph your product, having to wait to hear back on whether or not you violated the return and exchanges policy. I mean, it was just very broken, and it, I think, reduced the love for our brand. So there was a customer problem to solve. Second, on our team, it took a lot of time from our customer service team, customer experience team, manually on a one-off basis, looking at whether or not a customer violated the returns policy, manually attaching a PDF return shipping label in an email that someone had to actually do those clicks, type those buttons on the keyboard. And then on the P&L for the business, many, many returns could have been exchanges. And when you have so much friction, inevitably you lose many of these customers to other brands or to just nothing, right? Oblivion, they just drop off. And wouldn't it be great to offer customer the thing that they wanted to do, which is, if I'm looking to do an exchange, let me do it. Let me do it right away and let that product start coming to me right away. I don't want to have to wait. The size was wrong. I want to use your product. Let me use your product as soon as possible. I just need the right size or whatever it might be, right? That's the problem to be solved.
Yeah.
But when you can turn a lot of those returns into exchanges and potentially allow the customer to buy an additional product, that then becomes very interesting, where you turn pretty massive cost into a pretty massive benefit. So everyone wins, but it felt like there was just such a clear problem to solve because the pain was so visceral at the time. So that was very much the why. It was, gosh, so much pain. And it seemed like we could solve it.
Yeah.
Part of our ethos and approach, I mean, I mentioned I was at a consumer internet startup, and Tom, my co-founder, and a few of the other folks in the company were very comfortable with building technology. That was something that we did. I mean, we're the end of the day, we're all a bunch of nerds and we love to build software to solve problems. And Loop was just a product that we built for ourselves internally. And other brands, which was one of many things that we did, whether it be externally facing on our website, internally facing to just help us get things done. But this was just another tool we built for ourselves, not even thinking about whether it would be something that other folks would use. But other brands did come to us saying, hey, this would be useful for us as well.
Yeah.
And the thought hadn't even crossed our mind, but then we got to a point where, oh, okay, maybe it does make sense to make this available to other people. We don't want to be distracted by it, but because we were a little fearful of losing focus on building the consumer brand.
Yeah.
So did put an entity together, a team in place, that sort of thing. And so that team has done amazing things with turning Loop into what it is today.
Okay. I want to go back to, you mentioned one thing a couple of times. So I want to ask you that before I ask you, how do you, balance the time working on Chubbies and working on Loop? Like how do you, differentiate the two teams in the two big, gigantic, enormous companies? But I want to ask you, one particular thing, and this is my favorite question, which I have asked, I think, 10 people already who have built 9-figure businesses before or something. What the heck is a brand? So in this early 5 minutes or something like that, you have mentioned that word 4 times because I've been counting that. So, and it's just like, brand. Like, what exactly is it? A lot of the time what we see is people have associated this one particular word to logo. Sometimes it's the design entity. Like, a lot of people do that interchangeably. So I want to know from your perspective, because you're a marketing guy, or at least you
play one on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So what's a brand to you?
Yeah, great question. And it's an important question because the answer we would have given at the beginning for the first many years of the business, I think is a very different answer from what I would have given today. Speaking directly to what you said, logo, color scheme, font, though tone of voice, those things I consider to be branding components that serve as inputs into what your brand is. Not that they're not important, but they're not the most important thing. The most important thing is the brand, which is two things. In the mind of a consumer, it's the reason why they select you versus any other brand, any other provider of a product, I should say. It's the reason they go to you versus go to Amazon.com or Walmart to buy the cheapest version of that thing. Or it's the reason why they select you versus going through a completely rational process of comparing, at least for men's apparel, comparing materials, stretchiness, color, fabric quality, whatever those sort of like rational checkboxes you might go through if this was a completely sort of like rationally driven logical process. So it's in the mind of the consumer, it's the reason they purchase you. And a very special or important, I should say, detail of this reasoning is they don't have to be prompted by any kind of direct response ad. When they are in market and ready to purchase whatever product you make, when they're in market for your category, they choose you and they come to you without that need to nudge, right? Not that nudging is bad, but when you have a very strong brand and when the strength of the brand is increasing, the probability of them coming to you without being prompted goes up. Prompted meaning with a direct response ad, some ad that fills all of our Instagram feeds every day. Now, that's one component of the definition. From a business perspective, from the perspective of the actual company selling the thing to the consumer or even to business, the definition of brand that I've learned is the revenue you have when you turn everything else off. Meaning, what do you have when you turn off your ads? What do you have when you stop new product launches? What do you have? What revenue would you have if you turned off all of your promotions and discounts? What then do you have? That is the financial objective definition of your brand and the strength of your brand. And a great example is on one end of the spectrum, I think you have And again, nothing against this, but you have the drop shipper who's just finding these little arbitrage opportunities, finding something on AliExpress or wherever, right? Where people aren't buying from you because they know who you are and they have a strong emotional association with you. You're catching them on the click, and you're doing all of the things. That's one end of the spectrum. Again, nothing against that. On the other end of the spectrum, name any of the most famous brands in the world. Let's use Coca-Cola, for instance, Nike, for instance, right? If they were to turn off all of their ads today, they would still make a lot of money tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and the day after that. And that's because there's so much, one term that I did not know well at Chubbies, but I've since learned as I've been actually starting to try to understand real marketing and advertising and this marketing science stuff. It's just the notion of mental availability, right? It's the probability that when someone is in market for your product, they choose your product, right? That's mental availability. And so the mental availability for Coca-Cola, for instance, is as high as it gets, right? It's almost, if using a 100-point scale, it's almost 100 out of 100, right? So, okay. So to your question, there's the branding piece, right? Which is great. Not lacking importance, but it is a distraction if that's what you do view as branding or a branding exercise. Or if you go, say, I did a brand relaunch or those sorts of things. I do fear that they could be a distraction from the actual work of building and strengthening your brand. Because the reason you build a brand, the reason you start a brand rather than being a commodity or let's just use that, a commodity where the purchase is fundamentally because you're the low-cost provider. The reason you start a brand is so that you can generate profit, so that you can raise prices, so that you can have strong margins, so that you can build a business. And it should be the case that for an incremental unit of increasing brand strength, that should give you, whether it be more pricing power, the ability to sell more profitably, the reduced need to consistently and strictly rely on direct response advertising. Like, that is the reason you build a brand. If you're doing it just to update the colors on your website, that may not necessarily ladder up to the objective financial goals of building a brand. Not that it's bad, but that's what I've learned is the definition of a brand. And then once you have that clarity on what a brand means, and then there's much more clarity in terms of objectively how to increase the power of or the strength of that brand.
Okay, that's a great definition. You mentioned one thing, which is advertising and Nike and Coke and all that. So it's a two-part question that I have in mind. So one is, why Nike and Coke still run ads? So that is part one. And the second one is, for smaller businesses, for early stage CPG startups, advertising seems to be the only way to get into the market, right? So if I were to start a new men clothing apparel business, I know I'm competing against biggest the biggest. So getting the click, getting that type of attention is my only way, right? So I am not going to be able to build a brand, and I know it's a long-term game. I understand that, like, building a brand, like, it takes a decade or something, or like, I don't know what, in order to get to that point where people, subconsciously they have that, like, okay, if I need to buy something in the tech, I'm buying something from Apple, right? But it takes years and years to build that. So second question is, if I'm starting something new today, advertising, pay-per-click is my only shot. So what's your opinion on that? Like, how can small companies, how can early stage startups build a brand? And the first one is obvious, the one, like, why Nike and Coke still run ads. If they can turn it off today, still be the gigantic brands that we love, why do that? Like, why kind of waste that effort?
Great. So first question, Nike, Coke, name your large brand. Why do they still spend money on marketing, advertising? My answers would be super curious to hear them actually say this. But from my outside perspective, it would be two things. One, there is a decay curve, right? So let's say turn off all advertising today, you have 99% of the revenue you would have the next day, 99% of that the following day, right? So there is a decay curve. So why is there a decay curve? There's a decay curve because there's competition. There's still competition, right? Pepsi might start to build mental availability faster than Coca-Cola, and they might reach people who are just entering the soft drink market. They might also convert some previous Coke fans, right? So there's a competitive environment as well that I would think drives that component. The third, I think, is they're still trying to grow. I mean, I don't know what Coke's growth rate is from a top line or bottom line perspective, and same for Nike, but they're still growing businesses. There's still room to grow, even though they're some of the largest, most well-known brands in the world. There's still, some of them are growing very quickly. A very large world out there. So those are some thoughts on the biggest. On the second question, how do you get started? Is direct response, pay-per-click the only path for getting going? Whether you're CPG, any kind of like consumer brand, DTC or otherwise, it is an option. However, and it is, I don't want to make it sound like Chubbies didn't do any of this stuff. So we did for a long time. Maybe not at the beginning. I think at the beginning, when we had no money, we had to try to come up with things that were super creative, that got us free distribution. And that's the advice, or maybe not even advice. This is what we did, and I think it helped, and it worked for us. When we were going from zero to something, a very little bit of something, we were just not, as I've later learned, we were not just limited to the box of spending $1 on a direct response ad, measuring the ROAS, and then basically just fitting in to that very specific and maybe somewhat limiting box of thinking about growth. Like before that, it was, let's do this crazy campaign here on Facebook. Let's do this crazy grassroots thing where we could maybe take our email list from here to here. And maybe it would cost money in terms of time or people, but from a dollars perspective, it was quite limited. So I think that's the learning that I might suggest, which is no, there are infinite ways to do things that are memorable, that reach a lot of people, that are fun and creative, that don't necessarily rely on buying a keyword or targeting the audience of your competitor and then just having like a slightly stronger offer or whatever that might be. That might get you short-term increases or spikes in revenue, but in no way are you building that like fundamentally resilient base of revenue that I was talking about earlier that relates to the definition of brand. So to your point, it takes time, but it doesn't have to take a decade to get to any semblance of business. Right? When Chubbies started, we weren't even selling online. We were just selling to people in San Francisco. We were wearing the product. We were wearing little tiny bright shorts, and people would come up to us because the product was so different. And we happened to have some shorts in our backpacks. And this was also this was pre-Venmo. So we had the Square card reader that had just come out, and people would either hate it, talk about how we're a bunch of idiots, or people would love it. And they're saying, I love this. Where can I get this? And we would say, well, I happen to have them in my backpack. And then they'd swipe their credit card and then walk away with the product. There's so much that you can do with just traditional hand-to-hand combat of selling in person. Like that is a possibility. I also think of Liquid Death. I don't think they're running any PPC ads, right? And they sell water, for gosh sakes. I mean, the commodity of commodities. So, but they've done some amazing things where I look at the things that they're doing and I'm like, that's an awesome idea. And I'm sure that's getting a lot of reach and it's getting people to talk about it. And I walk away from seeing that thing and I'm like, these guys are awesome. These guys are so creative, so fun. And I just have respect for it as a person, right? Also as a marketer. So these things are totally possible. And it's less measurable. So I want to acknowledge that there's power. There's something very enticing. And again, we were enticed by this too at Chubbies as being very like data-driven, objective people. We wanted to be able to measure the accountability of every hard-earned dollar that we had, right? Because the fear is real that you might waste money, that you might light it on fire. If you try this crazy, like to use I'd say the most typical example is run a Super Bowl ad, right? That's millions and millions of dollars, but there are a variety of things in that category as well that you could just view as I might get something, but I also might get nothing, and I might completely waste this money. So there's a little bit of, we've been trained now to rely on this short-term real-time data that has been provided by the Metas and Googles of the world, which again, I think worked for a very long period of time and might even work to a certain degree today, because I'm not just saying only do non-direct response digital stuff, not at all. But I guess one takeaway I might try to leave people with is, let's not only do that. Chubbies only did that for a long period of time. There is a healthy mix, but in the earliest of early days, sure, maybe try a little bit of it, but there is a mental opportunity cost when you start allocating a lot of your time to the direct response only stuff. And then you start spending a lot of your time optimizing, taking your click-through rate from here to here, whereas maybe that time could have been better spent completely out of the context of whatever pay-per-click ad, and just really thinking about blank slate, Facebook and Google that has nothing to do with paid social, memorable, far-reaching thing that I can do that has nothing to do with paid social. And that is a real trade-off when you have real constraints. The constraint I would hearken it to or define it as is, on our team, we have 8, 10, 12 hours a day of thought minutes. And you're either devoting your thought minutes to this thing or this thing. So the more you do this thing, the less you're doing this thing. And so the opportunity cost is real in terms of where we devote our fixed number of thought minutes. So it is a real set of decisions we have to make. And it can so easily turn into allocating all of your resources to the very measurable thing, the thing that gives you the tightest, quickest feedback loop. And I get it. Again, I've done that. But looking back, I would suggest, and then I would, if I were to do it differently, I would hold off on that a little bit more, or I would limit the investment to something where I was still allocating a lot of my thought minutes to all of this other really interesting, creative, notable, fame-building things where you could, in theory, spend a lot less and get a lot more.
Okay. One thought that I usually have every single time I talk to, so I come from a world of product, so I don't understand a whole lot of marketing, a whole lot of, ads and stuff like that. I'm dumb that way. So the question that I want to ask you is, we have seen finest of the finest ads. I'm a huge football fan, soccer fan, not the football one. So, and we have seen, Nike did this thing, like amazing commercial. Never mention a day that, buy our shoes, buy the cleats, never mention buy the jerseys or anything like that. Just keep producing this sort of an ad, like tell the story. You happen to mention, Super Bowl. Most of the biggest brand would do the same thing, right? One thing that I had never understood, even though like maybe I never tried to understand that, is ads like these, the one that tells the story, they never tell to sell you anything. How do you measure, ROAS on that, ROI on that? Because, so for example, if I were to...
That's the $1 billion question, right?
Yeah. So if I were to, put this watch in an Instagram post and say, shop now, I can, it's very much tangible, very much data driven, right? How many people clicked, how many people buy, how many people did this thing, that thing. So it's just very transactional. I can measure that. But if I were to tell a story like how this one little tiny piece of tech improved my life because I have a nerve damage or something like that, and like how I like blah, blah, all of that stuff, how do you measure that? Like I never understood that.
Great question. And it has been historically hard and expensive to do that. So I will acknowledge that for sure. A couple of points, thoughts. One, if yes, you can measure that, it's very transactional. You can measure the ROAS on that watch ad you were talking about. Now, what happens if for some reason Facebook blocks your account or you didn't pay whatever, your ad bill, and so your ad's deliverability goes to zero, and then your business goes to zero? That is a real possibility for a lot of these companies who are trying to get off the ground. That could really happen, and that could put you out of business. So that is an existential risk because they haven't built anything in the minds of people to think, okay, why would I buy this watch if I didn't see this ad? Would I buy this watch if I didn't see this ad? Why would I, right? The reality is that that's how most transactions in the world take place or should take place, right? It's not a rational thing. It's an emotional thing, right? We're very lizard brainy, right? We don't make system 1 and system 2 thinking, right? Daniel Kahneman is amazing.
Yeah.
And we make a lot of our decisions with just this like quick, non-rational approach. And that's just the reality of humans. So one approach is think about the downside of only relying on that hyper-transactional situation, even if it is hyper-measurable. The downside is real in that if it stops for whatever reason, or if the economics change to where it becomes less profitable, you can very quickly go out of business because you have nothing else. You've built no other compounding asset value, which is our goal at the end of the day, right? It's something that can exist across many generations, generate lots of profits, create a lot of jobs, create huge financial outcomes for the owners, the creator. Like that's what we're all trying to create when we're selling anything online or in person, right? Now, a lot of us want it immediately, right? Which I totally get, but that's one component. The other is if you sort of think about, okay, let's tell this story versus let me just tell you, like you gave the perfect example. How do you then measure that? Now, the reality is that there's a traditional way, and then I think there's a non-traditional way that is maybe more modern. The traditional way has always been do a bunch of surveys on a bunch of people who kind of represent the general populace or your audience. And you ask them a variety of questions that then becomes your brand awareness number, your aided and unaided brand awareness, other sub-metrics, I don't know, like brand favorability or how people regard your brand. Some of it's objective, some of it's subjective, but I think even the objective stuff is very subjective. Chubbies has spent a lot of money on surveys, so done that, but a lot of shortcomings associated with that. But that has historically been the way that you then measure, okay, my brand awareness has gone up, therefore it should generally translate to a change in market share in my competitive set. How to quantify that has been historically very difficult. The reality, though, is that there are digital ways to do this. People are taking action on behalf of any company product digitally, whether it be via social media, follows, likes, shares, mentions, joining email lists, Googling your company name. All of those things are not purchases, but they are behaviors that have a dollar value associated with them that we should be able to value. It's hard, but that is a way, in theory, to measure this story type stuff, right? But at the end of the day, to sort of tie a bow on it, you have to believe that the reason people buy isn't always rational. And you have to believe that it is possible that people will buy from you without having to shove an ad in their face. If you believe those two things, you, I think, can get to the place where you could start to tell stories or just do very fun, memorable things that aren't begging for a transaction right away. And then in closing, a stat that for me completely changed how I think about this, because I was very much in the, I'm going to convert you. I'm going to convince you. Everyone I'm showing my ads to, they're in market for my product. And I just have to write a better caption. I just have to target it slightly better. I just need to make sure that I'm optimizing this image, the angle, right? The clarity of the product, the landing page, right? I mean, that's what I spent most of my time on for a very, very long time before I think we learned more about how to think about approaching effective brand building. But one of the stats that blew my mind was just the 95-5 rule that I knew nothing about for a very long period of time, which is 95% of your audience at any given time is just simply not looking to buy a product in your category. It's not about you. It's not about me as a worker, an employee at Chubbies. It's just about the fact that 95 out of 100 people who I'm showing my stuff to are just not even looking for men's tiny shorts or whatever your product is at any given time. Okay. They're doing their thing. So the reality is that if you're trying to build a business and a company and all you're doing is just begging for transactions, 95% of the folks who view that is just going to fall on deaf ears. So even if you're just purely an objective capitalist, you wouldn't view that as the wisest way to allocate your capital because you're simply not going to convince or force them down the funnel. So then objectively you would say, okay, well then what is the right way to talk to these people? And then I think that's the other way that you would sort of like objectively or from purely a self-interest perspective, get to the fact that, well, I need to tell stories because that's how humans work and that's how humans make decisions.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So I will go back a little bit, when you were mentioning that, like, I think you're 4 co-founders, like the 4 best friends build this brand. So unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know how to portray this thing. So I haven't had that level of success when building a brand with my best friend or something like that. So there was one particular time I begged one of my best friends to start a company with me, And like a year later, I was like trying so hard to just get rid of him. It happens in the startup world, right? It's not the best thing, but it happens a lot of the time. And you guys have done that like for a decade, or like, you've done it amazingly. So I want to know from you two things. How the four of you get along so well on business standpoints? Like, personally, maybe because you were best friends, so it's easier that way. So that is one, like, how'd you get along on business opportunities, business acumen, all that. And two is like, how did you guys divide the roles and responsibilities and make sure you're not overstepping each other and not like, pulling the racks, that kind of stuff? Because it's very easy to do that, because when it gets tough, and it gets tough really, really quickly, when you start building a company, it's very tough. So it's very common to start pulling the rank, like, hey, it's my company, it's my idea, this is how you got to do it, it's my way to do it. So how do you guys balance all of that?
Sure. So from a framework perspective, or in terms of how to approach it at the highest level, there's a non-zero risk in anything that we do, right? So when you introduce other people as co-founders, there's always the risk that it doesn't work out for whatever reason, right? That it just goes horribly wrong. But the upside is also very compelling. And so you make your risk-adjusted decision, but the upside, where 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 equals way more than 4, it equals 400. The fact that there's some probability that could happen, I think, at least for us, made it kind of like a no-brainer. And not that there was very much of this top-down, very strategic thinking as to whether or not there should be a co-founder or not. It was very much the process of coming up with and getting the thing started was conversation. It was sharing ideas and getting feedback on ideas. And so there was a very organic process where it just wasn't some person who had some idea in some kind of a vacuum and then started working on it and then went out and raised money by this, right? That's just not how the thing got started. So it was just a very natural, organic thing. So that's one thing. There's always risk, but then the potential for upside, at least in our situation, made it extremely compelling. But it was more than anything, more than any sort of like measured approach, it was very organic, and there was just excitement. It was just one of those things that just flows very nicely. One of the most beautiful things about just how people and momentum can build up very organically. The second thing is, I think we had a lot of respect for each other, respect for their perspective as being valid because of them being fundamentally someone worthy of respect persistently, which is huge, right? Because that plus the unshakable certainty that all four of us were aligned on what we wanted at the end of the day, on the ultimate goal, that we wanted what was best for the brand, right? Those two things, the respect and knowing that we all have good intent on behalf of what is best for the company, what is best for the brand, that, and again, to be super clear, not that it was always sunshine and rainbows, constantly arguing, like seeking truth, right? And not that we were perfect truth seekers, because sometimes personal stuff would get involved. Defense, I can only speak for myself, but like defensiveness, insecurities, inability to communicate effectively, all of those things happened, but the foundation was always there of that respect and certainty of good intent. So anyways, I think that was the approach, and that's my thinking on co-founders. And then I know just as an individual that I lack the ability, I think, to start something myself in the best possible way. I just need other people. So it's a realization that I have. Those are some thoughts on co-founders.
Okay. How big the team is on both Chubby side and Loop Returns, like in terms of total number of employees?
I'm not involved in the day-to-day with either of those businesses right now. So honestly, I don't know the employee count. I mean, I know for a time at Chubbies, when we had a lot of stores open, maybe over 100, given most of them being store employees. But I mean, I think, gosh, I don't know, maybe let's say roughly 40 to 60. Loop, I have no idea, to be honest. I've never been in the day-to-day outside of that sort of like very initial 0 to 0.5 sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. The reason why when I ask you is because in my relatively smaller career, what I've seen, like I've only been able to see taking companies from 0 to 1. Like that's where I spend most of my time. I've never been, like maybe 1 to 10 as well, but never been able to be a part of the company where we have actually taken the company from 10 to 100 or 1,000 or whatever you want to put that number on. The reason why I want to ask you that question is because hiring 10 employees is very fundamental. It's very strategic. You need to be able to figure out these are the people that we want to work with because it's trenches, it's hard work and all of that. In terms of, values, in terms of building that sort of a culture, when you move past those 10 people, like you get to, I don't know, 100 people, you get to 500 people, you have managed to open branches across the countries, across the globe. How do you make sure that, every single person, the employee, I don't know, 590 that you're hiring today is also aligned on the same values? He's also becoming the part of the same culture. How do you do that?
I'd say it's hard, very hard. And then you do have to make decisions as a company builder. And we got some really great advice from one of our board members who was one of the co-founders of Netflix. And they were very well known for their culture doc and for their culture. But one of the decisions you have to make is, are you a family or are you a team? So family makes very different decisions on how to discipline, who's in or out, right? Very different from a team, right? So it's a real decision. And I think for a long time, we chose to be more like a family. And that was a decision that we made. Not that meritocracy did not exist, and not that we didn't evolve, and not that we didn't have a healthy balance, but that's a decision. The other thing I might say is it's hard. It's very hard. And I personally would say that I never mastered the art of recruiting, hiring, of growing people, of even being a great manager. I mean, I wouldn't say that I was really good at any of those things. I tried. I think I learned some things, but they're very difficult. But even with 100 people, I do think it's possible to still be a part of interviewing every person, at least that's touching your part of the organization, spending time talking a lot about how you view the business, why you exist, who you are, and seeing if you can tease that out and see if that's something that really resonates with this person. For us, we chose passion, culture fit above other things because we believed that people who were fundamentally multidisciplinary and very excited and passionate about what we were doing could learn. Because none of us were classically trained really at anything that we ended up doing in building this business. So obviously over time that changed when more specialization happened and where we really wanted to find the best of the best. But for a long period of time, it was very much generalist, interdisciplinary. Are you hungry? Are you excited? Are you passionate? Are you committed? And that's very much what drove it. But then from a culture perspective, we just spent a lot of time just trying to talk about it and articulate why we existed, who we are, how we view things, how we intend to operate, in hopes that it would resonate with the people we brought on.
Awesome. So appreciate all the wisdom, Preston. So what we do is we have a decent big of an audience now. Very, very fortunate of having all those people who listen to us and whatever we're producing. We recently crossed 60,000 downloads on Apple Podcasts. Wow. All of that stuff, like we're in top 20 US entrepreneurship, not to brag.
That's great. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's all the, it's all the people that we have the privilege to host on the podcast, like nothing special about us. One thing that we do is we kind of made this a hobby. Every single time anybody's coming on the podcast, we float out this message, sometimes in the email, is sometime on LinkedIn, like here or there. Like, Preston is coming, send us your messages, send us your questions. So we got a lot of those questions for you. Obviously not going to have time to go through all of them. So we try to figure out the best of the best, or at least the ones that are worthy of your time. Okay. So some of those I already asked you, or you have touched those already, so I'm going to skip those. But the ones that really need your answers, I'm going to ask you those. Okay. So, so the first one is, the journey is like never easy. What would be your advice for founders who are just starting out, regardless of industry? Like, could be CPG, could be SaaS, could be any industry.
Any industry? Yeah. What would advice be? So there's a little bit of a nagging need to do something. If that exists, just pull that thread. But if that doesn't exist, and if the reasons for getting started in the first place are, I want to get rich quick, or, because you probably won't get rich.
Okay.
It's going to be hard. I mean, I do believe in Elon's quote of like, what is it? Building a company is like eating glass and staring into the abyss, or something like that. I mean, it's just very hard. I mean, that's the reality. And there is a non-trivial percentage or probability that you'll just not be successful. You'll not make money. You will go out of business. You will fail. Now, failure is a very interesting word. My belief is that failure only happens when you quit, when you give up. So I should be more thoughtful with how I use that word, because if the first business that you start goes out of business, or for some reason doesn't work, you have so many opportunities to change, to tweak. Pivot, I think, is a trendy word. There is infinite opportunity in the world. There are infinite things in the world today that are broken, that can be fixed by people no smarter than you and me, right? Harkening back to the original quote from Jobs. So in terms of getting started, advice getting started, knowing that it's going to be hard, knowing that there's probably a higher probability of your first thing or second thing or whatever, not working than working. And that's okay. Like Jeff Bezos' quote is, he thought he had a 30% probability of Amazon being successful, right? Jeff Bezos, I don't know where he went to school, Princeton or something.
Yeah.
Amazing, brilliant person. Was a quant trader or something at one of the best firms. Like, so many reasons why anything this person does should be successful, but he still put a 30% probability on success. And I think he raised his first money, giving up 30% of his business. Maybe he raised like $1 million or something, right?
Yep.
Jeff Bezos. So when a person like that tells you that, oh, maybe I have a 30% probability of success, like rose-colored glasses, constant optimism is needed. However, there's also a practicality component to it. The practicality, the importance of acknowledging that that it will for sure be hard and that there is a high probability of this not working, I think allows you to be prepared for the inevitable, extremely difficult, heart-wrenching times that will absolutely come. Because this isn't just, I want to start something. Oh, I'll just spin up my Shopify store or whatever. Oh, I'll just find a supplier. Oh, and then I'll just start tweeting screenshots of my Shopify revenue page showing how it's going up and to the right? That is not reality.
Yeah.
That is not reality. So is your reason for doing it compelling such that you will persist? That's all you have to do is just persist. So many overnight successes, right? That took a decade or 25 years or 50 years or whatever, right? They just persisted. That's it. It's just like constant pressure applied over a long period of time is how you go from not doing it to doing it. And it's going to be embarrassing. You're going to look like an idiot to your family and friends, to people you respect, right? They're going to be like, what are you doing? Why are you giving up time with your family? Why are you working so hard on this thing that you're making no money off of, right? That, I think, is one of the hardest components of this whole thing, right? Because you're an idiot until you're brilliant. There's really nothing in between. So Are you willing to be an idiot believing something that most other people don't? Because that's fundamentally what you're doing when you're starting a startup, is you believe something that most others don't. Are you willing to do that and be the idiot for a very long time and just continue to persist? Like, are you internally validated enough or are you externally validated? I tend to be very externally validated. And so that's something I fight all the time is ignore the noise. What is the mission? And just be focused there. Am I doing the right thing? Are my inputs as correct as possible? So anyways, those are a couple points, a couple thoughts, but when you're doing it, you have to think a lot about this. Remind yourself, why am I doing this? The other thing I would say harkens back to your co-founder question, like the infrastructure was in place, right? I had 3 other people who could pick me up when I fell down. 3 other people who, regardless of if we had a bad day, we could just talk to each other and that made it okay, right? And then I think the final thing is it's not about the destination. Like, so trite, but it's having lived it, it is so true. The win is the work, right? If you have the opportunity to work with people you love or work on something you love or both of them, that is the win in this life. There is no better win. And so to the extent you can acknowledge that the pain, the fire drills, the midnight emails, but the wins too, the ups and the downs, that is truly the win. It's not some mythical binary exit. Then I think you're also ready to do it. Because one of my favorite quotes from the Founder podcast is like, so many of these founders who have been extremely, extremely successful, A, they didn't care about the money, but 2, their only exit plan was death. And I just love that. Like, they're just going to do it. They just love it. They love the game. And why would they do anything else?
Yeah. I asked somebody a question, some institutional VC, I think that I had a privilege to host him on the podcast, and they've like, managed to have like, I don't know, a dozen plus exits or something like that. And I asked him, do you really need to have an exit in mind, like every single time you start a company? And I did not know that because I was naive at not know that. And then he taught me this thing, and he was like, the best of the best companies are never meant to be sold. The best liquidity event happens when the founders are not looking to, sell the company or do something like that. It's just because they love it so much that they just want to continue to do that. Exactly as you're saying that. So totally agree.
Yeah, they can say no. Like, they could say no to the $1 billion acquisition.
Yeah.
Like Mark Zuckerberg did, right? To who was it, Microsoft or Yahoo or whoever, because he believed in something. He loved what he was doing. He probably had an acknowledgement, not only that the vision was so large and he was on a mission to accomplish it, but then on the converse, that what would I get with those dollars, right? I mean, I would still want to do this thing regardless. And so many examples of that to support your point.
Yeah. Okay. So the second one is, VC-backed CPG/DTC businesses are going out of the business, and 2023 has been a tough season for them. What's your take on why so many companies got shut down or on the verge of bankruptcy?
Yeah, it's hard, man. It's really hard. And a couple of thoughts. So VC, a lot of nuance here, right? So like it depends who you raise money from, what their fund timelines look like. So basically, like how long-term are they? Who is the partner? Did they take a board seat? What kind of control do they have? And then you as a founder, how much control and strength of vision do you have to do the right thing, even if it's painful in the short term? So there's all this nuance. There's also how much you raised, which then completely governs the size of the outcome you are then required to deliver on, or at least you think that as a founder. So some nuance. For instance, Chubbies raised in total, 10 to 15 million or something like that. Some VC-backed CPG and probably the minority of that from traditional VC.
Okay.
So wealthy individuals, friends and family, advisors formed, I think, the majority of the capital raised. I could be misquoting, but I think I remember correctly there. So source of capital is also very important. What are their timelines? It doesn't have to be VC only. There are a lot of sources of capital out there. Family offices, ex-founders who've had exits who are looking to maybe work with 3 or 4 or 5 different brands. Like there's a lot of money out there that isn't necessarily traditional LP-backed VC that needs the unicorn to justify all of the failures to hit that whatever unlevered 25% IRR that they need to deliver to their LPs, right? There are a variety of ways to go about it. Now, the thinking on my thinking on VC and consumer brands and raising a ton of money is this: if you've got time, if you've got at least a decade, great. But you're not going to. There are outliers to everything I'm saying here, but in general, this just takes time. Unless you've invented or patented something where your product adds 20 pounds of muscle to your user without adding any fat and reduces your biological age by 50%, then sure, by all means, you need to raise as much money as possible and move as quickly as possible. Now, if you're selling yogurt and you have some slight nuance where the source of your protein is whatever, then sure, there's a product differentiation, but it is still going to take a lot of time. And you might get into a lot of stores quickly, but then you have to sell through, right? And all this stuff, again, people aren't going to make their buying decisions fully rationally. To acknowledge that, it takes time. You'll get some very highly involved people right away, but it'll take time. So this is all to say that the thing that generates profits for a consumer product, by and large, unless it is massively technology differentiated or patented or whatever it might be, is a reason for a consumer to pick you versus the million other alternatives, right? And that just takes time to get there. And the only way to get to the most profitable form of new customer acquisition and retention is, as I was talking about earlier in the conversation, where it's when people come to you without being prompted by any kind of direct response. That takes changing minds.
Yes.
Changing minds takes time. So it's very much a time thing. And then it's also just fundamentals of these types of businesses versus the traditional fits for traditional venture capital. But again, acknowledging that I think in our minds, we all have a very specific, like it's like raising money from Sequoia or name your sort of like top tier Sandhill VC firm where in general, they're looking for decacorns, right? These $10 billion exits, but they're taking these massive risks on cutting edge technology, things like that. The opportunity that they have in making those bets is that if the 1 out of 100 are able to grow extremely quickly, they can do the very basic thing of turning off massive headcount expansion, turn on the sales machine, and then they can really start to generate a lot of cash very, very quickly. And that spigot is something that's simply that inflection point where profit generation becomes massive and gives you that 20, 30, 200% IRR when the first 10 years of the business, you lost money. And then for the next 10, you're generating exponential profit growth That just doesn't exist with the vast majority of consumer brands. So just the IRR calc, in my opinion, just doesn't work for a traditional VC. Now, obviously, the VC thinks it does. That's why they allocated the capital. But we just haven't seen it unfold for the vast majority of these businesses, even the ones that have gone public.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, I think, is tied to the fact that they weren't able to either they tried to monetize beyond the strength of their brand. So if the brand and the size of the brand, the strength of the brand was always outpacing how they were monetizing it, whether it be with product expansion or just expansion in a variety of ways, I think they would have been able to grow much more sustainably, much more profitably. And when things didn't work, like the things I was talking about at the beginning of the call, new product launches, direct response marketing spend, store openings, when some of that stuff doesn't work, you still have that resilient base because that is your brand. And again, this is all consumer focused. Like I'm not speaking about all of the other types of businesses, but those are just some thoughts. And again, not that I wouldn't take money, but I would be very thoughtful on who you're taking money from and make sure that they acknowledge the amount of time it takes and are going to be okay with some kind of I wouldn't say a middling outcome, but just acknowledge the reality of consumer brands, right? That it just takes a lot of time.
I want to ask you this question, and the reason why I want to ask you is because to your earlier point when you're saying the CPG brands take it takes time. So I was reading something I don't know a week ago or something like that, specifically around venture-backed CPG businesses. And one thing that I have learned is the CAC is always higher in CPG business compared to a SaaS business. So it's just like, like this platform that we're using. So they can spend, I don't know, like $10. I become the customer. If they provide the value, I continue to use that. They don't need to spend the same money again and again. If I'm in apparel business, I need to sell one short. Nobody's buying that on subscription, right? So it's just like, you need to keep acquiring more and more because it's never ending loop. And then again, you need to burn a lot of money in order to do that, unless you kind of go creative and do all of that. So the question that somebody asks you is, which is again of a lot of interest to me as well. So CPG brands are a lot harder to grow compared to SaaS businesses. Is there a way, early founders or people who are just starting out, they can learn something from the SaaS industry and implement that into the CPG industry?
That's interesting. I mean, candidly, I need to acknowledge my lack of expertise in SaaS, but it's an interesting thought experiment where, I mean, one thought that comes to mind that we always thought about when we were doing Chubbies was, gosh, wouldn't it have been great if we got into like the socks subscription business or whatever kind of like apparel subscription business.
Yeah.
We actually tried to do subscriptions. We called it a Chubscription. And
how did it go?
Not well.
Okay.
But we tried it. But from the perspective of SaaS, right? I mean, the reality with SaaS is that yes, it comes down to product, but it also comes down to the brand. It also comes down to how it is marketed, how it is viewed by the buyer. Now, albeit likely a slightly more rational buyer, but not completely, right? Because the buyer of SaaS is not doing a feature by feature comparison. Now, obviously, those comparison tables exist on many of these websites, of course. But it's still, I trust this one versus this one. And it might not just always come down to product features. So the reality is that you learn from SaaS that brand matters too. The association that you've built, where you've built trust, that this is the, whatever it is, like this company has the best people. This company is going to have the best customer service. Like there's something that gets you to believe that they are going to be the best thing for me. And I might even pay more versus this other one. It might not be just strictly features-based, right? So I think the parallels abound, and I don't think it can be simplified or distilled down strictly to subscription versus non-subscription. However, if you're able to build a subscription business in consumer, like by all means, but I think it's more around rationale for trust and belief in you that the consumer has that I think can be very applicable to what we're using. Like even the software, like Riverside that we're using to record this podcast, right? There must be 100 other podcast recording softwares out there. However, 100% of the podcasts I've done are all in Riverside. Now, I haven't done the analysis on a feature by feature basis or how they're charging or what the upsells look like or whatever, but clearly Riverside has become the de facto. And that's the power of trust and brand and social validation, etc.
Okay, awesome. At present, we do have one small ritual on the closing ritual on the podcast. So what we do is we ask all our guests a question for our next guest without telling who the next guest is going to be. Obviously, got a question for you, and obviously going to take a question from you for the next guest. Okay.
How fun.
So the question the last guest left for you is, in your recent memory, what one social post / article has changed your opinion on anything? Like one post you saw and you were like, oh, okay, I viewed it differently, that kind of a thing.
This is such a good question. And it's also making me realize how much of an echo chamber I'm in, where I'm not really exposing myself to the diversity of perspectives that I really want to be. I wouldn't say this is super recent, but honestly, I've just been so... the example I think I would use is a lot of the things I talk about are more recent realizations, whether it be from the latest days at Chubbies to even after. And the reason I bring that up is because I did, for a very long period of time, think that you just had to be a great performance direct response advertiser in order to win in consumer in the modern age. So I do think that seeing how Liquid Death, as an example, as just one brand that I just tend to follow somewhat closely, has just played a different game. Yeah. And so their posts specifically, and not that Chubbies never tried to come up with crazy ideas, but just the ability that they've had to do these non-obvious things at an extremely high level that then it achieved extremely high organic reach. I've just been very impressed at. And so I think that has changed my thinking and given me more confidence in being able to say, if I were to do it again, or if I were to share any kind of a recommendation, I would say, look at those folks. Because, and again, I could be totally wrong. So I think I would use that as a caveat, but seeing some posts from them time and time again, where maybe 2 or 3 things that they have done have just sort of wowed me as both a consumer and as someone who, I guess, practices the craft of doing these sorts of things, in terms of, wow, that's just so good. And they're just, everyone's zigging, they are zagging, and they're doing the right thing. So I'd say that would be my answer right now. I don't feel like that's 100% the answer I want to look back on and be super proud of, but I do think it's constructive enough to share as an answer to the question.
All right, sir. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate all the wisdom, all the candor, all the knowledge. So thank you so much again for the time. It means a lot to us.
Thank you. Yeah, full of gratitude for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. The questions were great. I thought this was extremely high quality and fun, and I hope it will be useful to your audience. Thank you.
Absolutely. This is it from today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching and listening. All the resources and links that we have talked about, they're all in the description or in the show notes, depending upon which platform you're on. If you're watching it on YouTube, please mention down in the comment, did you like it? Did you not like it? What do you want us to improve? Who do you want us to invite on the channel? If you enjoyed this episode, there are chances you're going to enjoy that episode as well. So we're going to link it down somewhere here. Do hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that already. And thank you so much for watching again. And I'll talk to you soon. See you in the next one.